Our poor little village is dead. All the people have gone stiff or fled. There is no more noise, except me and my toys, just like all the dark birdies said.
Believing that superstition is the refuge of the ignorant offers a certain comfort, that the charm nailed above a threshold, the salt scattered at a doorstep, the warning a mother presses into her daughter's ear about which woman in the village never weeps, that all of it is only the harmless residue of a people who have not yet learned to think clearly about the world. It is a comfort I have watched crumble more than once. For in the cold pine country of Kul Tiras, in the mountain province that men now call Drustvar, every one of those warnings was true. The signs the frightened folk repeated could indeed mark a witch. The dread passed hand to hand across the generations was not idle, and not one of those signs, in the end, was enough to save them. So the question that followed me out of that province was never whether their fear had been foolish. It had not been. The question is stranger and colder than that. How does fear stop being the thing that warns a people and become the thing that rules them? I am Aldrich, a keeper of records. In my younger years I studied among the Kirintor in the floating city of Dalaran, and for the long middle of my life I walked with the Explorers League through the ruins of kingdoms that had forgotten their own names. Of all the places I have set my hands upon, Drustvar is among the few that taught me more the longer I stayed away from it, as though its lesson needed distance to be understood. To stand in Drustvar is to feel watched. The land climbs quickly from the coast into dark mountains, and the forests there grow close and old, their trunks silvered with frost, even in the warm months. The villages huddle in the valleys as if for company, and in every one of those villages, when I passed through them, I found the same quiet architecture of unease. Iron horseshoes turned mouth upward above the doors, bundles of herbs left to blacken on the sills, children who had learned, before they could properly read, the ways one tells a witch from an honest woman. A witch, they would tell you, cannot weep. A witch cannot be burned, for fire will not take her. The blood flies that torment every other traveler will not settle on a witch, because her blood has gone foul in her veins. And a witch can never be sick, never retch, never empty her stomach, for it is full of dark spirits that hold their place. These were not the fancies of a few nervous elders. They were the shared inheritance of a whole people, repeated with the certainty of law. I have spent enough years among ruins to recognize a particular kind of belief when I meet it. There is superstition that grows from nothing, from the fear of the dark that lives in every animal that has ever slept in the open. And there is superstition of another kind, the kind that feels heavier than it should, that carries more specific weight than a mere fear of shadows ought to carry. The witch lore of Drustvar was the second kind. It was too precise. It named things, and a fear that names things is almost always a memory that has forgotten it is a memory. That is where this record must begin, not with the terror the Drustvar folk carried, but with the thing their terror was made to forget. For the fear had an origin. It had once been knowledge, and to understand how that knowledge curdled into dread, and how that dread was one day turned against the very people who kept it, one must go back past the villages and their charms, to an age before there was any such thing as a witch to fear at all. The people who gave the province its name were not human. They were the Drust, and they had come to Kul Tiras long before the first human sail ever crossed that stretch of the great sea. The chronicles have never settled plainly what the Drust were. The likeliest reading, drawn from the cast of their bones and the shape of their faces, where the old steles preserve them, is that they were a branch of the Vry Kul, those tall and Titan-touched folk from whom humanity itself is thought to descend, for the resemblance runs close enough that many who have studied it can arrive at no other conclusion. Yet the stones stop short of proving it, and I would not pretend to more certainty than they allow. What is not in doubt is that they were a seafaring people, that they made landfall on that island in some distant century after the world was broken and remade, much as other wandering tribes took to the open water in those unsettled years, and that they settled its cold heart and called it home. Their roads still cross the province. Their cairns still stand on its ridgelines. Their ruins, the great gray places whose names still carry the old word goal, remain scattered through the pines like the bones of something too large to bury. And here is the first truth that most who tell this story leave out, because it does not fit the shape they expect the Drust to have. In the beginning, the Drust were not monsters, they were druids. Before the age of the king whose name would poison everything after him, the Drust kept the old ways. They were keepers of the balance, tenders of the cycle in which life and death are not enemies but partners, each feeding the other, neither to be feared and neither to be worshipped. The order that preserved this understanding was called the Thorn Speakers, and they were not so different in their heart from the druids of any other corner of Azeroth. They walked in the blessing of what they held to be the wild gods of that land. Athair, the great white stag they named the heart of the forest, and Athain, the dark doe who walked beside him and kept his secrets. It was said to be the favor of those two that had first taught the ancient Drust their druidry, and to the Thorn Speakers, the woods of Drustvar were not a haunted place to be warded against. They were kin. As long as the trees stood, so too would those who spoke for them. I find that I cannot pass over this quickly, because everything that comes afterward is a corruption of it, and a corruption only frightens properly once one has first seen the thing it corrupts. The Drust understood death. That was their gift. They did not flinch from it, and they did not covet it. Death was a season. It came and it passed, and something grew in the turned earth it left behind. Then came the king. The records give him the name Gorak Tul, and they give him little tenderness. Where the old Drust had held death as one turn of a wheel, Gorak Tul saw in it a source of power that could be seized and held and pointed like a spear. He turned from the druidism of his ancestors toward a darker art, a death magic that did not honor the cycle but broke it, that did not let the dead pass but bound them, wrung them, put them to use. And the first thing that magic was used upon was not any human enemy. It was his own people, for there were Drust who would not follow him. Among the Thorn Speakers was one called Seph Ewen, who spoke against the king's hunger and his cruelty. And Gorak Tul gave her a choice that was no choice at all, to take up his war or to vanish into the woods forever and be seen no more. She chose the woods, believing he meant only exile. He did not. He killed her, and he tore her spirit from her body, and he shackled that spirit to her own remains so that she would haunt the ground where she fell for as long as his power lasted. Her ruin was left as a lesson. This is what becomes of those who will not serve. This is the price of conscience. It is worth pausing on what that act truly was, for it is the seed of the entire history that follows. Gorak Tul did not simply eliminate a dissenter. He made her death into a message, and he made that message eternal. He understood before he ever raised a hand against the humans that the most efficient weapon a ruler can wield is not the sword that kills a single enemy, but the terror that governs everyone who hears of the killing. Fear reaches further than any blade. It does the work of 1,000 soldiers and asks for no wages. And so the thorn speakers who remained looked upon what their king had become, and many of them chose to break from him entirely, to walk away from their own kind rather than serve a throne built on dread. It was the first fracture in the Drust, and it was not caused by an enemy. It was caused by the king's discovery that his own people could be ruled through fear. The humans came later, some 27 centuries before our own day, if the oldest accounts are to be trusted. They were sailors from the mainland, folk of the young empire of Azeroth, and the eldest chronicles hold that many of them hailed from the line that would one day become Gilneas. They found an island of cold forests and stern mountains, and they began, as settlers do, to build small hamlets, fishing camps, the modest beginnings of a life. They tried at first for peace. The records are consistent on this, and I have always found it one of the more mournful details of the whole affair. The newcomers offered gifts. They sought terms. They behaved as people do who wish to share a shore rather than fight over it. And the Drust of Gorak Tul answered them not with negotiation, but with slaughter. They fell upon the settlements without warning and without mercy, and the accounts record with unusual bluntness that they glorified the killing of the unarmed. This was not war as most peoples understand it, a contest between fighting men. It was terror deployed as policy, precisely the instrument the king had already tested upon his own kind, now turned outward against strangers. And it very nearly worked. This is the part that the comfortable tellings prefer to soften. The humans did not sweep in and cleanse the land of a barbarous foe. They lost. For years they lost. They were driven from their own settlements, forced to abandon ground they had cleared with their hands, because the death magic of the Drust was a thing their swords could not answer. You cannot cut a curse. You cannot outlast a spirit. A people can be brave beyond reckoning and still be losing, and the settlers of Drustvar were losing. What saved them was not courage. Courage they already had, and it had not been enough. What saved them was knowledge. There was among the human houses a family called Waycrest, and at its head in those years a soldier named Aram, a colonel who would end his life a lord. Aram Waycrest understood something that his desperation had forced upon him, that a fear you understand is only half a fear, and a magic you have studied is a magic you can break. Rather than throw more men against a horror he could not comprehend, he sent his people to learn it, to probe the Drust magic for its seams, to ask coldly and patiently what the enemy could not abide. And out of that grim study grew the Order of Embers, an order founded for no purpose but to turn the light of understanding upon the thing that terrified them. Their patience was rewarded with small, homely truths. Silver, it turned out, wounded the Drust magic where steel could not. Certain fires, brewed with an alchemist's care, would burn what ordinary flame refused. Even simple things of the kitchen and the field held power against the curse when a person knew how to use them. It sounds almost absurd, laid out so plainly, that an empire's dark sorcery could be answered with silver and fire and the humble contents of a larder. But that is precisely the point, and it is a point worth holding on to, for it will matter greatly before this record is done. The antidote to terror is not greater terror. It is knowledge. The moment the humans understood their enemy, the enemy stopped being a nightmare and started being a problem, and problems can be solved. The Order of Embers set down what it learned in the pages of a tome, the Tome of Silver and Ash, and kept it in a place called Golvar, so that the hard-won knowledge would not die with the ones who bled for it. The tide turned, and as it turned, Gorak Tul did something that reveals the whole shape of his soul. Running short of living warriors, he did not surrender. He reached back into the same well that had drowned Seth Iwan. He seized the souls of his own dead people, bound them into effigies of wicker and stone, and drove those tormented constructs forward to fight in place of the fallen. He tortured his own kind past the point of madness and set them marching. The king who had once ruled a people of druids ended his war as a man who would spend the very spirits of his subjects like coin, so long as it bought him one more hour of power. The end came at a place called Gol Osigur. Aram Waycrest led the final assault, and he was not alone. The Thorn Speakers who had broken from their king fought at his side, and so did the white stag Ather himself. For the accounts tell that Aram had once found the great beast wounded from battle with the Drust, and, rather than take its life, had healed it, and the wild god repaid that single act of mercy by turning against the tyrant who had betrayed the balance. There is a quiet symmetry in that which I have never stopped admiring. The kingdom of fear was undone, in part, by a moment of kindness that fear could not have predicted. Aram drove his blade into Gorak Tul, and in that instant the king's power broke, and the constructs he had animated with stolen souls shattered where they stood. But, and everything hinges on this small, stubborn word, Gorak Tul did not die. He was wounded, gravely, past the point that should have finished him. Yet his spirit slipped free of the ruin and fled into a place beyond the living world, a gray and blighted realm called Thros, where the dead of the Drust had been gathering all along. He did not fall. He merely went where the living could not follow, and there he began, with the terrible patience of the dead, to wait. For his part, Aram Waycrest was made a lord, and his house was given dominion over the province, and Drustvar took its name and its rulers from the war that had nearly destroyed it. That should have been the end. In most tellings, it is, and in the way that most tellings differ from the truth lies the very heart of what I came to Drustvar to understand. In any tavern in that province, an old man asked about the Drust will give a telling that is almost right and wrong in exactly the ways that matter. He will tell you that the stone constructs marched throughout the whole long war, when in truth they were a desperate measure thrown up only at its bitter end. He will tell you that Lord Aram slew Gorak Tul outright, when in truth the king was only wounded and endures to this day. He will tell you that the Drust army crumbled because their king had fallen, when in truth the living Drust were already broken before Gol Osigur, and it was the constructs, not the king's life, that shattered at his wounding. The shape of the truth survives. The load-bearing details do not. This is not the failure of any single careless storyteller. It is what always happens. A people who defeat a horror tend over the centuries, to keep the horror and lose the method. They remember that they were afraid. They forget precisely what they did about it. The fear is vivid and needs no maintenance. It lives in the body and passes from parent to child without any effort at all. But the knowledge, the silver, the alchemical fire, the patient study that actually won the war, that is fragile. It must be taught and understood and used, or it fades. And so it faded. The very fact that the Order of Embers would one day have to be raised again from almost nothing tells us how far it must first have fallen. A living discipline of scholars and inquisitors worn down, we may reasonably suppose, across the quiet centuries into something nearer to ceremony than practice. The tome of silver and ash, by the time it was wanted again, lay as a relic in the ruins of Golvar rather than a manual carried by every hand that might need it. The Waycrests ruled. The land grew safe, and safety, as it so often does, made the people forget why they had ever been unsafe at all. What remained when the knowledge had drained away was the fear with nothing left to answer it. The witch lore I found nailed above the doors of Drustvar, the woman who cannot weep, the blood the flies will not touch, the fire that will not burn her, carries, to my reading, the unmistakable weight of that old struggle. For the craft such a witch would one day wield is Drust magic at its root, the very deathwork that had once marched upon the settlers, and knowing that, it is not hard to see in each of those signs a splinter of the real war, worn smooth by time until its origin was rubbed away. The people were not making up their terror out of nothing. They were remembering something true. They had simply forgotten that they were remembering, and forgotten above all that the horror they dreaded had once been beaten. They kept the nightmare and mislaid the cure. And this is the thing I want to set down as plainly as I am able, because it is the pivot upon which the whole history turns. Superstition, in a place like Drustvar, is not the opposite of knowledge. It is knowledge that has decayed. It is a memory that has forgotten it is a memory, and so can no longer be used, only feared. A people in that condition are more vulnerable than a people who never knew the danger at all, because they carry the terror without the means to act on it. They will jump at every shadow and reach for nothing that could actually save them. Their fear has been separated from its answer, and a fear separated from its answer is not a defense. It is an open door. Gorak Tul had a great many years in the gray silence of Thros to consider exactly this, and when at last the door was left open wide enough, he was ready. The opening, when it came, wore the face of love. That is what I find hardest to carry about this final chapter, and what I think most people miss when they speak of it as a mere tale of witches. It did not begin with malice, it began with grief. Not so very long ago, in an age near enough to our own that some who lived through it still draw breath, the Lord of Drustvar was a man named Arthur Waycrest, a distant son of the line that Aram had founded. He fell ill, a wasting sickness that no priest could pray away, and no physician could cure, and his wife, the Lady Meredith, could not bear it. She loved him past the edge of reason, and as the sickness took him, she began to call out, in her sleepless despair, to any power at all that might spare her the loss. She did not go looking for the Drust. She was not seeking dark magic or ancient vengeance. She was a grieving woman crying into the dark for help. The dark answered. Gorak Tul had been waiting in that dark for centuries, and he heard her, and he came to her in her dreams with a mercy that was really a hook. Death, he promised, would never part her from her Arthur. She had only to do a little thing in return. She had only to gather others to her, to teach them what he would teach her, and to help him, at the last, cross back into the living world. In her grief, she agreed at once. She would have agreed to anything, and so was born the Heartsbane Coven, out of a wife's love and an ancient king's patience, in the very manner of the house that had once destroyed him. Absolute power, when it takes root at all, so often grows from a seed as small as this. Meredith did not raise an army. She did not march on the villages. She simply began inviting young women of the town of Corlane up to Waycrest Manor, as noble ladies had always done, for company, for instruction, for whatever polite reason the old customs allowed. The women went up to the manor by night and came home by morning, and at first no one thought anything of it, because nothing looked wrong. That is the cruelty of the method. The corruption spread through the ordinary channels of trust, wearing the shape of the everyday, and by the time that shape had become a lie, it was already far too late to notice when it had changed. Meredith took a new name among her followers. She called herself the Mother, and under that name the coven learned what the Drust had always known: how to bind the dead into wicker, how to curse the living, how to twist the very grain in the fields and the beasts in the wood. The magic bent their bodies as it filled them, and when one of them grew strong enough in the craft, she would open her own throat to rise higher still, ascending into a matron of the coven, power purchased, as it had always been purchased among the Drust, at the price of the self. The witches began to take people. Those they did not recruit, they kidnapped and carried to the manor. The guards of Corlane were cursed into obedience, their eyes lit with a pale, unnatural glow that marked them as no longer their own. Sisters of the coven went out across the province like seeds on the wind, one to Aram's stand to prey upon the very refugees fleeing the horror, one to the soldiers of Watchman's Rise, one to Falconhurst, who raised there an army of wicker men she named for the briar. Village by village, the province fell, not to a conquering host, but to the quiet spread of a thing the people could not bring themselves to name until it was inside their own homes. And here is where the whole of this long history closes its circle, and where I understood at last why the fear of Drustvar had always felt too heavy to be mere superstition. The coven did not need to overcome the people's dread of witches. The coven fulfilled it. Every sign the frightened folk had whispered for generations, every charm and warning and old wife's tale, the Heartsbane witches simply became. They were the women who never wept. They were the ones the fire would not take. The people's own inherited terror, which should have been their armor, became instead the perfect disguise for the thing that hunted them, because a fear you cannot act upon does not protect you. It only tells you again and again how afraid you ought to be while doing nothing to save you. The witch lore had been true all along. It had simply been stripped of the one thing that made it useful. The people remembered to dread the witch. They had forgotten the silver that could kill her. There is a further cruelty in it still, one that the folk of Drustvar visited upon themselves. When the terror grew great enough, they began to turn upon one another, to accuse, to hunt, to condemn. In the town of Fletcher's Hollow, when the coven struck, the people rounded upon Lucille Waycrest herself, the heir of the very house that had once saved them, and named her a witch. This is what weaponized fear does at its ripest. It does not only serve the powerful who wield it, it sets the frightened against the innocent until a people busy hunting phantoms among themselves have no strength left to face the real thing in the manor on the hill. The mother could not have designed a better shield than the panic of her own victims. What broke the spell was the same thing that had broken it 27 centuries before. Not greater fear, knowledge recovered. Lucille Waycrest, cleared of the lie told against her, went back to the ruins of Golvar and the forgotten pages of the Order of Embers, and she relearned what her ancestors had bled to discover: the silver, the alchemical fire, the truths of the Tome of Silver and Ash. She refounded the order that time had let wither. She and those who stood with her walked back up to Waycrest Manor, past the cursed guards and the wicker horrors and the ambushing sisters, and into the corrupted heart of her own family's home, where her mother and her undead father waited. The mother fell there, and when she fell, the door she had spent her love to open, the rupture, the seam between the living world and blighted Thros, tore wide, and Gorak Tul at last stepped through into the daylight he had hungered for down all the long years of his waiting. He was struck down almost at once, but as he fell, the old king revealed a final, mocking truth. The thing they had slain was only a vessel. Gorak Tul himself endures still in the gray depths of Thros, undefeated in any way that lasts. The coven was broken, the province was freed, the witches were scattered, though whispers of them lingered in the mountains for years after, needing to be hunted down one by one. But the patient dead were not destroyed. They were only, once again, made to wait. I have turned this history over in my hands for a long time, the way one turns a stone found in a ruin, looking for the mark that tells you what it was for. And what it tells me, in the end, is this: Gorak Tul never truly needed his armies. His war against the humans he lost, and lost badly. His greatest victory was not the one he won on any field. It was the one he won across the silent centuries afterward, when he did nothing at all but wait for a people's memory to soften into fear, and then let that fear do the conquering for him. That is how fear becomes a weapon, not when it is loud, not when it comes at the head of an obvious horror that a brave soul can lift a sword against. Fear becomes absolute when it is inherited, when it is handed down through the generations as instinct rather than understanding, until no one alive remembers where it came from or what once answered it. A people who know why they are afraid can act. A people who have forgotten why and kept only the dread can only tremble and reach for charms that no longer work and turn at last upon each other. The witch beneath the bed was real, but so was the silver that could end her, and of the two, only the terror survived in the telling. That is the whole tragedy of Drustvar in a single line. So I return to the question I carried out of those cold mountains, and I find it changed in my hands. I asked how fear stops being the thing that warns a people and becomes the thing that rules them. The answer, I think, is that it happens the moment a warning is remembered but no longer understood. Knowledge protects. Fear, cut loose from knowledge, only obeys, and it will obey whoever is patient enough to claim it. The people of Drustvar were never weak, and they were never fools. They were something more ordinary and more dangerous than either. They were a people who had kept their fear in perfect condition and let the reason for it rot away. And yet I would not end this record only in that gray place, because Drustvar itself did not. There is a counter-truth living in those forests still, older than the fear and quieter than it. and its name is Ulfar. He is the last of the true Drust druids, the final thorn speaker of the ancient line, and he remembers what all the rest forgot, not the terror, but the knowing. He remembers that death is a season and not a throne, that the cycle is to be tended and not seized, that the woods are kin and not a haunting. Where Gorak Tul built his power by making his people fear death, the thorn speakers kept their wisdom by refusing to. That is the whole of the difference. The one turned death into a weapon and ruled through dread. The other accepted death as part of the living world, and in doing so, could never be ruled by the fear of it at all. As long as the trees stand, the thorn speakers say, so must those who speak for them. It is among the oldest vows in that province, and one of the few that has never yet been broken. Gorak Tul is still out there in the blighted quiet beyond the world, waiting as he has always waited. The coven is broken, but the word witch is still spoken low in the mountain villages, and the charms still hang above the doors. The fear has not ended. It has only gone quiet again, which is to say, it has begun once more to be forgotten. And that is the thought I cannot set down, even now, even having written all the rest of it out. For if superstition is only a warning a people have stopped understanding, then I find myself wondering how much of what we all carry in every land I have ever walked is exactly that. How many of our own certainties are the worn, smooth splinters of some true and terrible thing our grandfathers knew and we no longer do? How many doors we believe shut have only been left by the slow work of forgetting, quietly open? The wind off the Drustvar peaks carries the smell of cold pine and old stone, and it does not answer such questions. It only moves through the trees, patient as the thing that waits below the world, and lets the fire in the hearth gutter low, while a keeper of records closes the book and sets it back upon the shelf, where it will wait, as all records wait, for someone who still remembers how to read them.